15th. We're in the third week of Advent, but today we have the memorial of St. John of the Cross, and I'm going to talk about him because he's kind of a fascinating figure, 16th century Spanish saint. He's a priest and a doctor of the church. So first, I'll talk a little bit about the upcoming schedule for the week. Since this is Monday, I hope everyone had a wonderful weekend and enjoyed Gaudete Sunday, Rejoice Sunday, as our Advent season starts to bring us ever closer to the celebration of the Nativity of the Lord at Christmas. So this week, we do have confessions tomorrow evening from 5:30 to 6:15 p.m. at St. John the Baptist, and then there's Mass at 6:30 p.m., and there's then followed by the Rosary. And then on Wednesday morning, there are confessions from 7 a.m. until 7:45 a.m., and then Mass at 8 a.m., and then adoration begins after Mass and closes with benediction about 10 till 7 on Wednesday evening. And then Thursday and Friday we have Mass at 8 a.m. Just a reminder too that next Monday, the 21st, so a week from today, I will have what we call Day of Grace confessions. So following Mass, so at 8 o'clock, I'll go into the confessional, which we're using the Adoration Chapel as the confessional right now to allow for distancing, but there's the option too then of going anonymously behind the screen, or there's a chair there to go face to face or mask to mask at this point, I guess. So I'll be there at 8 a.m. I'll stay as long as there are people and to go to celebrate the sacrament, and then I'll leave and come back at 9. Do the same thing, 10, 11, 12, all the way till 7 p.m. So at the beginning of every hour, I'll be sure to be in there. And that will take place on Monday, the 21st. As I mentioned at the beginning, we do have the memorial of St. John of the Cross, priest and doctor of the church. And as I mentioned too, he is a Spanish mystic saint, and he was a close collaborator with St. Teresa of Avila, and a great reformer of the Carmelite order, the Decalcid Carmelite, the barefoot Carmelites as they're called. And so John had a pretty tough life growing up. His father was from a wealthy family but married a poor woman, and it kind of meant that he lost a lot of his kind of family wealth. He was kind of disowned for doing that. So it sounds like his family was involved, I think, in the silk trade. So he was able to, I guess, work as a silk weaver to support his family, but died when John was only, I think, 1 year old. And so I think his wife, so John's mother and his two other brothers were left with them. And as a widow with 3 young sons, it was very difficult. And it sounds like the conditions were so poor for them that one of his older brothers did die from their poverty. And John was sent then to an orphanage where he learned to read and write and was clothed and fed. And first he was tried to apprentice for a few different trades, but he really didn't have any aptitude for that. He ended up working in a hospital, and that's where he kind of found part of, I don't want to say his calling, but he had great aptitude for that. And all of his biographers will mention that he was very kind of direct and honest with everybody that he worked for. He was in a hospital that was really for people with venereal disease at that time, and he would do whatever the most menial jobs there were without complaint. And he treated everybody the same, poor, rich, didn't matter. And it was very consistent in that. And that was noticed by the administrator of the hospital. And so he was sent to kind of probably what we would call a Jesuit high school to do some more studying. And excuse me, the director of the hospital promised that if he went away and became a priest, was ordained, he could come back and be the chaplain for the hospital. So I think that was originally kind of his plan, but he starts to develop this desire or vocation towards monastic life. And it's after he studies that he comes back and after he's ordained, to celebrate Mass in his hometown, as kind of priests still do to this day, and that's where he ends up meeting up with Saint Teresa of Avila, and she's working at that point to um, reform the Carmelite order. At this point in Spain, Spain was very powerful. A lot of exploration of the New World had brought a lot of gold back to Spain, and probably because of that wealth and power of the country, a lot of the monastic communities became pretty lax in how they were approaching it, and were taking on a lot of creature comforts and a lot of worldly values. And so Teresa of Avila was striving to reform them, and she had papal approval to do that. And so she recruits John and a couple other priests to help her. So John becomes a spiritual director and confessor for a a convent of sisters, of nuns, Carmelite nuns. And he starts to do that. Now, other people, the other parts of the Carmelite order weren't real happy with these reforms at times. As you can imagine, it's, if we want to take away all their creature comforts, and from every indication, John was very austere in his lifestyle and was not necessarily shy about calling other people out kind of for living too worldly. He did not endear himself to his fellow seminarians when he was studying to be a priest because of that. And so as they're taking this on, St. Teresa of Avila has kind of the Pope's backing. So she has some protection there. John of the Cross doesn't. So he gets put in prison by other Carmelites, the ones who were very violently against these reforms. They imprisoned him, and it sounds like the descriptions of it are very, very harsh. It's hard to believe that part of a religious order would do this to another member of their religious order just because he's trying to reform them. But that's what was going on at that time. And so he was put into a cell. It just had one little window at the very top, like a slit, not even a window, that wasn't even open to the outside, but to a hallway. He had very little light in there. So to pray, he had to stand on a bench or a stool so he could pray just when the light came through in little bits and pieces. But during this time, he starts to really develop his best known works too. Kind of these really love poems to God. But he uses the imagery of light and darkness in very effective ways, and it's during kind of this confinement that he's able to compose a lot of these poems, even though he really didn't have anything to write with. His jailer was very mean to him too, and it wasn't until later, I think, right near the end of his captivity, that a jailer who was slightly nicer gave him a little notebook that he could take some notes. Well, eventually, and he struggled too because, he didn't know if what he was doing was right. He's going against his superiors. And so that caused some turmoil in his life, his spiritual life too. So eventually he escapes out of, he makes a little rope. He loosens the lock, I think, on his door is how it says. And he's able to finally kind of bust out of this prison. He had managed to loosen the lock on his door and tore 2 small rugs into strips to make a rope. He climbed out of his prison by night and descended the high walls of the priory, only to find that he was in the enclosure of the Franciscan nuns. Confused and calling on the Blessed Virgin for help, he found his way through and over the wall and down the city walls. This is in Toledo, and not Toledo, Ohio, Toledo, Spain. And eventually he gets out into the street, and everybody thinks he's drunk. He's exhausted. He's, in horrible shape. He's been in the dark and poorly fed and abused for years now, or for months. And so people thought he was drunk. He finally makes his way to the house of the Discalced Carmelite nuns who had just come out of the chapel, and the prioress does take him in. Now, she breaks all the rules by allowing to bring him into this cloister, but her excuse was there was a dying nun who needed a priest for confession. So once he could come in for that, then the sisters took care of him and, in a way, kind of nursed him back to health. And so eventually he's gotten out of Toledo and is able to come back into the Carmelite society really after this. It doesn't seem like there was any. I don't know what the repercussions was, but were for this, but I didn't come across how exactly this all worked within the superiors, and there could have been a change in superior too that helped, or the reforms were starting to catch hold. So they didn't come and try and get him back into prison at all. He spent a lot of time at this point, he was dictating his poems. His poems are well known. His four probably best known works are his best known poems are "The Dark Night of the Soul," and that's probably his best known. And then his other works, "The Ascent of Mount Carmel," "The Spiritual Canticle," "The Living Flame of Love," and they use kind of this allegory of the love between kind of man and woman as an image of love between the soul seeking the love of God. And so he uses, like I said, light and darkness, consuming flames, wounded, suffering, pursuing, finding. Those are some of the themes that you find from his works. So he didn't want to really be an administrator, but he spends a lot of time as just as a confessor and writing, putting a lot of these treatises together, and the ones that he tries, people were asking him to kind of explain his poems, and so he does some of those. The treatise, the Ascent of Mount Carmel, in a way, kind of goes with, I think, the Dark Night of the Soul. It's kind of an explanation, and those are written on slightly more in theological basis, but he is a great mystic author. And it does talk about that he and Teresa of Avila, although, they didn't always, I don't want to see eye to eye. They were very different personalities, it says, and that, we think about these two saints kind of joined together, and that, they must have been, since they're saints, they must have been, just always so, on board with one another. But it sounds like Teresa had a very different personality than John, that she wasn't kind of in that way, that mystic. She was driven and organized, and he not as much. And so there could be a little tension, I guess, between the two because of that. But we honor both of them as great saints, and his cult of sainthood goes well beyond the Carmelite order into the wider church. So that's St. John of the Cross. So we'll ask, he's known as the mystical doctor. So we'll seek his intercession this day as we all continue to look out and pray for one another. And I do pray that through the intercession of St. John of the Cross,